Hi, I'm Adrienne Kovach, and I'm here to talk to you about New England's only native rabbit. Can't hear me? Here to talk to you about New England's only native rabbit. So here we see some of the features that can describe it and distinguish it a little bit, including it's a small rabbit, has small eyes, a little bit occasionally black spot between its ears. These are features that actually distinguish it from some similar species in New England, including on the left the eastern cottontail, which is actually not a native species. It was introduced here in the early 1900s for sport hunting. And then on the right, a much larger lagomorph, the snowshoe hare, which you can see by the tracks are quite different. And hares turn white in the wintertime and the cottontails don't. The New England cottontail, it has very specific habitat requirements. It needs forest that's in the very early stages of its growth, young forest, early successional habitat, shrublands, we also call these thickets commonly, and sometimes they also are found in the understory, in the forest understory, where there's maybe laurel underneath a tree canopy and things like that. So this is what New England cottontail habitat looks like. There are a number of species that provide nice cover, as well as a number of species that provide the food that they require. So important food sources are berries and the fast-growing young shoots. Having a very dense cover is really important for thermal protection, but also very important for predator protection because, as I pointed out, the differences in the eye size, New England cottontails have very small eyes and poor predator detection ability because they've always been associated with this very thick habitat. So historically, this type of young forest has been created by a number of natural disturbances. For example, ice cover and flooding were able to sort of open up areas alongside of riverbanks and streams, providing very nice shrubby wetlands. In addition, beavers have also created a lot of this nice habitat because although they dam up rivers and streams, those dams don't stay there forever. Beavers eventually move on when they use up their food sources, and then the dams break down, those areas dry out, become a nice beaver meadow, which eventually then does convert into young forest, which makes nice early successional habitat. Other disturbances include wind and ice storms, fires have also created these habitats in our landscape. And then lastly, clearing forest for farmland is a way that these types of habitats, once that regrows, this provides that young forest growth. And we are aware that in New England, a great proportion of our landscape was cleared by European settlers, and most of that is now reforested. So our landscape today is such that young forest is very rare in New England. Natural disturbances are fewer and on a smaller scale. Development is prevalent, and New England is heavily forested today. So that means that we don't have a lot of this early successional habitat, but there's a number of species that require them. And many of these species are actually on the decline, so including many shrubland-dependent birds, such as our golden-winged warbler and prairie warblers. Then we also have black racers, Karner blue butterfly, woodcock, and bog turtles are just a few examples of creatures that need this habitat, and they're on the decline. Among all these species, the New England cottontail is actually one of the most threatened. It is a state endangered species in New Hampshire and Maine. It has been a candidate for federal listing since 2007, currently under review by the Fish and Wildlife Service with a decision pending this year. Formerly, it was much more abundant across New England and eastern New York. Currently, it's found in only a few, about 5 isolated geographic areas. If we look just at New Hampshire and Maine, where I'm focusing today, we can see even in very recent times some pretty dramatic declines. So here in New Hampshire, the blue areas show where there are currently known or recently known small populations of cottontails. It's not continuous in comparison to these red lines where they were found earlier. Their extent was much farther north. And if you look on the right, similarly for Maine, the red locations are specifically where we know there are cottontails today or recently. Comparison, we've got green and gray locations, and a much broader extent in green. We see a significant range contraction even in the last 15 years. Okay, so because of this scenario, because of the population status, which is pretty poor, there is a range-wide effort to conserve the species. And this is a collaboration across all sorts of partners and national resource managers. And the focus, of course, is to build up the populations. The focus is in these black areas where we know that there still are or recently were bunnies, okay? That is logical to work in those areas. And most of the effort involves making habitat, all right? So creating those disturbances, which are much more rare naturally today. And this also involves effort with landowners who might be interested in improving habitats for wildlife. And again, the goal is to create more of this on our New England landscape. Another component of this big restoration effort is to create more rabbits to then fill into those new habitats that we're trying to create, because there simply aren't enough rabbits on our landscape to inhabit the areas that we're creating for them. So there's a captive breeding effort in Rhode Island at the Roger Williams Park Zoo. They're breeding the rabbits in captivity, and then ultimately the goal is to translocate them into natural habitats. Before they're released into the wild, they'll go into an intermediate area. This is a holding pen, but that is an example of where they'll be kept before the release. Okay. And then at UNH in my lab, our contribution to this is that we're doing some research to try to inform the restoration effort, specifically to try to give information for where and how the habitat restoration should take place. The reason that we need this information is because we actually know very little about New England cottontail ecology. Specifically, we know very little about how they move in the landscape, how they disperse from one area to another. But we need that information if we want to understand how to reconnect them. We need to understand how the cottontails actually interact with their landscape. So if these are habitat patches for the cottontail, how is it actually moving through the areas in between? Can it disperse through forest or field? What happens if there's a road? Things like these. These are the types of questions that we're trying to get at. And we're using genetic approaches to get at this. So we can use genetic data to understand the relatedness of the different rabbits. And from that, we can tease apart dispersal patterns and movement patterns. And then we're relating that with the landscape to try to understand how that influences their movement. So much of what we know about cottontails from this work actually happens by not ever seeing or touching a rabbit. It all comes from their fecal pellets, which we collect in the wintertime from surveys in the snow. And we can get DNA from these fecal pellets. And from that, we're able to figure out where the rabbits are, because you can't really tell the difference between a cottontail fecal pellet or a snowshoe hare fecal pellet. Trust me, they all look the same, but their DNA is different. So we know where the New England cottontails are, and then we can identify unique individuals from their genetic signatures. And that's the information that we use to then figure out the movement patterns between these individuals based on how related they are. So this is an example of an effort locally, so the New Hampshire, Maine region, all the places where we've sampled rabbits, and I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about what we've learned. So here, once we have our samples from the area, we're looking at specifically how the landscape affects the movement. So what I'm showing you is sort of a close-up of southern Maine. This is the Kittery area. Here's I-95. Here's Piscataqua River, so this is the Rawlings for Dover area over here. The red circles are where there are New England cottontails, okay, they're in their patches, and the rest of the little red blips, that's their preferred shrubby habitat. Sad, there's very little of it out there, okay? So just the red, that's their preferred habitat. The rest are things like forest, fields, development roads that you see, water, okay? So we did our analyses to look at how these different features influence the cottontail movement. And we found that, yeah, as you'd expect, their preferred shrubby habitat, that facilitates dispersal and movement. That's beneficial. We also found that some wetlands that also have that kind of habitat, those also are beneficial and facilitate their movement. But then when we looked at the other features that are out there in the landscape, which dominate the landscape, they were primarily had negative influence on cottontail dispersal. So they were barriers, they were impeding their movement. So this includes things that you would guess, like development. Sure, that's negative for bunny movement, but it also includes things like forests, which is a vast portion of the landscape there, fields, okay? And then we get to, and water, open water is also a barrier. And then we get to roads, which are kind of interesting. And roads we see have this dual influence, both positive and negative. And so the reason why is that roads, if a rabbit is trying to cross one, that's obviously a barrier. This is a very dangerous thing to do. However, roadsides often have some nice shrubby habitat along them, and so the bunnies are actually using that to move along and to disperse along. So in essence, roads can provide like a linear conduit from getting from place to place, and the rabbits do use that habitat along them to move along. And so we also found some other linear features that function as these dispersal conduits, including power lines and railway corridors, which also tend to have that kind of thicket habitat, and they can use them to get around through the rest of the landscape, which is pretty unsuitable for them. Okay. Couple other things that we found. We were also able to do some comparisons across our study area and answer some questions about fragmentation effects. So we have, this is the southern Maine and New Hampshire study area that I mentioned, which is actually very fragmented. The cottontail patches are few and far between. The I-95 bisects part of it. The river is a barrier across part of it. In contrast, we have Cape of Elizabeth below Portland, where there are a lot of patches that are very close together, and there's a lot of good habitat in a very close, area, so it's pretty connected. And what we found then is that in the unfragmented habitat, the facilitating effects on dispersal were the most important, and there was a lot of connectivity for them. But down here in the barrier, in the fragmented landscape in Kittery, those strong barrier effects were the most important thing, and negative, of course, for the rabbits. And so lastly, just to bring it home, we've used the information that we learned from that to try to identify corridors that can connect our two isolated populations. And while I-95 is a direct route, that's not a great place to focus restoration efforts. So what we see here in orange are areas of best connectivity based on habitat preference and dispersal preference. And this highlights a really nice area that is alongside of a power line that runs west of I-95. And that's a practical area to focus restoration efforts. That's manageable. Build patches off the power line, and maybe in doing so, we can reconnect these populations that were once connected, but today they're isolated. And that is it, but I do want to thank special people, Kelly Boland for providing slides, and 2 graduate students who did a lot of this work.
Adrienne, you have a question?
Yes.
Yes. How suitable is the habitat in the lakes region for potential cottontail or snowshoe hare utilization? And if it is suitable, what can we do to enhance it and make it more suitable for a transplant program?
That's a great question. So the lakes area hasn't had cottontails in it for a while, and so it's not an area that is currently being actively focused on, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be added if there was a lot of interest in creating new habitat. So I believe it would require a lot of, creation, which does require clear cutting and stuff like that. So it is a potential, but I could hook you up with people in cooperative extension, for example, who would be very good at talking to you about the actual feasibility of such a thing.